Good morning. Mr. Day, Dr. Biggs, Honorable Mayor Grimminger, presenters, participants, and all those interested in French colonial history. I hope you are as happy to be here as we are delighted to have you. My name is Sarah Menard. I'm the president of the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve. And there are other foundation board members here, John Carroll, Janet Leonard, Sandra Cabot, Jack Ketting, Vicki Ketting will be joining us shortly. So on behalf of the board and all members of the foundation, I welcome you to this history conference. And this year we are very lucky to partner with the Center for French Colonial Studies. I know you will enjoy the conference. While you're here, I hope that you have time to explore this wonderful little town and find treasures on every block. We are glad to share this town with you. Thanks again to all the conference organizers from the Center for French Colonial Studies, especially Richard Day and Helen Dahlquist and Sharon Person, Mark Barbeau, and the foundation, former President Bob Mueller. And as you know, Bob has had a vision for the history conference and has been the driving force for a great many years. And he, of course, gets lots of help from Director of Tourism, Sandra Cabot. So on behalf of the foundation and all of St. Genevieve, welcome. I also want to say happy birthday to the National Park Service. The first presenter, Tim Good, is a 26-year National Park Service veteran, has been a superintendent of the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site since 2009. He's a graduate of Valparaiso University and the University of Durham, England. Tim served a variety of NPS assignments, including the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, National Mall, and Ford's Theater sites in Washington, D.C. Also at the Springfield, Illinois Lincoln Home and the Cuyahoga Valley, Ohio National Park, and the Dayton, Ohio Aviation Heritage Park. Also, he helped develop the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors System, a computerized database of over 6 million soldier records and several thousand unit histories. He's published 4 books on the subject of American privateers and Abraham Lincoln. And so please, at this time, welcome Tim Good, who is going to tell us an update on St. Genevieve and the National Park Service. Tim?
Thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. And before I begin, I just want to highlight Sharon. Sharon, can you stand up to help put this all together? There you go. I know it's not easy to put conferences like these together, and she was especially patient with me because you may have heard the federal fiscal year ended yesterday. Today is the first day of the new fiscal year, and as of Monday, I had to tell her I wasn't sure whether I could attend or not, but fortunately the bill passed, and I'm happy to be here with you today. I have brought, again, my talk's about the Park Service study of St. Genevieve, and my prepared remarks are intentionally short to provide an opportunity for questions and answers. But I do want to highlight before I begin, here's a copy of the study. I have brought the last remaining ones here. These are free. You may take as many as you like. But again, these are the last copies that we have available. And I know many people in St. Genevieve already have copies if you have not seen them. And this study will go down as a very remarkable one in Park Service history, and I'll explain that to you here in a minute. First of all, I want to talk about the 2 types of studies that the National Park Service conducts for new areas. One of them is called a reconnaissance study. Now, a reconnaissance study does not require any attention from Congress. The Park Service can make that decision on its own. When the Park Service finishes a reconnaissance study, though, it makes no specific conclusions, only a recommendation as to whether Congress should look into a special resource study, which is much more involved than a reconnaissance study. In the case of St. Genevieve, they skipped over the reconnaissance study and looked right to the special resource study, and it's very fitting that we are assembled here today because on October 11th of 2006, is when the president signed the legislation authorizing the National Park Service to conduct a special resource study of St. Genevieve. So just 10 days from now will be the 10th anniversary, and I'm very thankful to say we completed it in less than 10 years. Of course, ask the question, why did it take so long? Well, as Sarah said in my introduction, the timing actually personally worked very well for me because I was selected as the superintendent of Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site the same year that funding became available for the study. The Park Service did not receive funding until 3 years after the legislation passed. And so from that moment to today, that 7-year period, is when we completed the study. That still begs the question, why did it take 7 years? When I first became involved in my association here with St. Genevieve, I approached it as I would any other potential National Park Service site. I must admit, all my assumptions at that time proved completely incorrect. What you have here is truly unprecedented. Now, I'll cite a few examples from my National Park Service experience. If you come visit the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, you will find there are 5 historic buildings. But the Park Service's attention is focused on one, the main house. If you visit Lincoln Home National Historic Site in Springfield, Illinois, you will find multiple historic buildings, but you will find the Park Service's attention focused on one historic site. If you visit the Truman Home, the Carl Sandburg Home, the John Muir Home, if you go through all these, you'll find a very consistent pattern. It does not apply to St. Genevieve, because you do not have one single historic building upon which to address your attention. Instead, you have multiple ones of equal importance to actually have a village. There is nothing like this in the National Park Service today. And so when the study team was approaching this, again, it had no precedence. And it required a great deal of study and discussion with the community to complete the study. And I do want to highlight, this study arrived, the conclusion that it arrived at, which I'll discuss here in a minute, would not have been possible without the support from this community, from the books that have been written, all the work that has been done. I've seen many a study arrive at a negative conclusion simply because nothing had been done prior to justify the national significance of that place. And that was not the case here for St. Genevieve. Now, the Park Service uses 4 different criteria to determine whether a site should be brought into the National Park System. The first criteria is significance. All those individuals who work to establish St. Genevieve as a National Historic Landmark District truly laid the foundation for the Park Service easily to arrive at the conclusion that this was nationally significant. And I was greatly helped by many of the books, Carl Eckberg's and others, who helped again lay that foundation. The second criteria is feasibility. The Park Service felt it was feasible as well. Suitability, the Park Service felt it was suitable. And the final criteria is the most difficult of them all. And that is to make the case that a place needs National Park Service management. And again, in that case, due to support from the community, the Park Service decided that, in fact, there was a need for Park Service presence here. Now, to tell you how remarkable this is, the Park Service arrived at a positive conclusion. The woman who headed up the study team for the Park Service, she's been conducting studies for the past 7 years in the Midwest region. And the Midwest region includes the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Missouri, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, a very large portion of the United States. Of all the studies, dozens of them, that she headed up the past 7 years, this is the only one where the Park Service arrived at a positive determination. It shows you just how rare this is. Now, once the Park Service finished its study and submitted it to the United States Congress, and technically the role of the Park Service has officially ended at this point. It's up to the United States Congress to determine whether they will follow through with the Park Service recommendation and bring St. Genevieve into the park system. Now, I also want to describe the 13 acres that the Park Service team focused on as being part of the park system. In this case, it would be the Delisle Kern House, the Ambrose House, and the Beau House. However, the legislation that's currently pending before the United States Senate allows the National Park Service to be involved in a much larger area comprising the National Historic Landmark District. So the flexibility of the bill that's currently pending is much greater than the Park Service proposed, and does give the Park Service potentially the flexibility to be involved in far more than simply those 13 acres. So again, in conclusion here, before I open up the question and answer, this study, this conclusion that they arrived at, this positive determination, is truly a compliment to all of you, to this community, and the phenomenal work that you've done. It would not have been possible without that. And it's truly a testament to the nature of this community, and I will fully admit, I thoroughly enjoyed being a part of this study for the past 7 years. I always feel very invigorated and excited about American history and historic preservation because of the people that are here in St. Genevieve and the people elsewhere that support the efforts here in this village. So thank you. Okay, Bob,
one thing that St. Louis, me especially, is impressed by is St. Genevieve has a good sense not to keep the city in the floodplain after the 1785 flood, but move uphill. We have this kind of problem in the Mississippi River Valley, Missouri River Valley too, of people who figure, well, we just make the levee higher and don't worry about it. We can live in the floodplain. We have that right in Chesterfield, Missouri, this problem. Well, they went ahead and they built in the floodplain, and they had the 93 flood, and they were fine. They had to have 10 feet of water in there. So I'm impressed by the way they're using the land that had been St. Genevieve until 1785 as a big field. And I'm hoping that that becomes a real good focus of this whole thing. Because the Midwest is going to feed the world. There's a perfect example of how we do it.
Well, that's a great comment. And in fact, when I was reading through the final study for the first time, there were several aspects that surprised me, but one of them was a recommendation that the Park Service made in this study to expand the National Historic Landmark District to include the common field, the big field. They were so impressed with the national significance of that acreage that they believe that it should be included in the National Historic Landmark District. And that was technically not part of what the study was, but something the study team arrived at as they studied this remarkable place. So that's a very, very good point. Yes.
What are the prospects for the passage of the bill, and do you have a prognosis?
Okay, the question is, what's the prospects for the passage of the bill, and do I have a prognosis? It's a very good question. I would be curious to know the answer myself. I have to be very careful here. Federal employees are prohibited from lobbying Congress, so please do not take any of my statements as indicating my personal preference for lobbying. There was some talk about the bill perhaps passing before the July 4th recess. Obviously, that did not happen. The next time when Congress is to assemble, I believe, is going to be in December. And so that would be the next opportunity for passage of the bill. Historically, this is termed a lame duck Congress, and sometimes they can be very active, sometimes they can be very passive in terms of legislation. And so we'll just have to wait and see how that transpires. If the bill does not pass in this Congress, it would have to be resubmitted in the next Congress, which convenes in January of next year, and then go through the process of having hearings accordingly. On the Senate side, I do want to point out that the Senate held hearings on the bill. The Park Service testified in favor of the bill, and the Senate committee voted unanimously to send the bill to the full Senate. So clearly there is support there for the bill at this point. Yes?
I know you can't be involved in lobbying efforts, but you could give us the names of both the House and the Senate bills so that we could write letters.
As an American citizen, that is your right. I don't have them the numbers memorized at this time, but I've Do you have it, Bob?
I think that house is 5305.
Okay, but I'll say this, your two senators are Roy Blunt and Claire McCaskill. They're very familiar with this, this process, and your Congressman Smith is also very familiar.
We have people from all over the United States
that's
and
good.
Canada at this meeting.
That's a good point. Well, Bob has the numbers for the bill, Bob Euler, so if you see him, and he'll be able to give you those numbers.
Couldn't he announce it now?
It's Senate Bill S 2954
2954 in
and
the Senate,
House Bill HR 5305.
5305 on the House side.
I'm originally from Hudson, Ohio, and I experienced,
You're
I
kind of
was
valley.
a background,
Yeah.
of course, right next to the national Cuyahoga County, not county, went to Summit County. But what I observed over the years, I found it so interesting how they expanded into the canal history and the railroads and the railroad excursions. And I was wondering if you could, because you've experienced both, could you kind of draw any parallels? I know they're different animals.
No, that's actually an outstanding question. I mean, his point was how the Park Service has developed a very comprehensive interpretation program on Cuyahoga Valley, when on the face of it, it just looks like a beautiful piece of land. But the Park Service has gone through the canal history, the railroad history, the farming history, really developed an outstanding program there. And that's a great question, and it really does apply here to St. Genevieve. One of the aspects of interpreting of the village that I find so intriguing, as did the Park Service team, was how comprehensively you can talk about the people in this village. I especially want to talk, I mean, you have, just look at just take the Baquette Bow. Hank's done a great job of pulling out some of the diverse history there. Look at the Bolduc House, the Ammo House, and the Lavamanier House. Did I get that right? And then, I mean, look at those four, and you have a broad range of socioeconomic stories that you can tell, and add a lot more to the history of the village and interpretation you could if you just, instead of having just one historic site, which may only focus on those individuals which are at the upper level of the socioeconomic scale. So that aspect alone provides so much more information than you would otherwise. You can talk about slavery here, you can talk about the tribes here, you can talk about the lead mining here, the Mississippi River, and how that affected here, the big field. It's truly remarkable historic resources that still remain. And I was thinking about this before. I know of no example in the United States where you would have that opportunity. In fact, I would have to step on the international stage. You can consider someplace like Pompeii, where you'd have that many historic resources still remaining, and you can tell all aspects of the society. And the Italians do an outstanding job at Pompeii of talking about, specifically on the economic side, how you have, in the Roman society, there was a concentration of wealth at one end and not at the other, and they actually have the buildings where they can tell those stories. And here you have that at St. Genevieve as well. So when you talk about World Heritage nomination, you have an opportunity here to step on the international stage and talk comprehensively about society and village that in other Park Service sites you simply don't have that opportunity. Yeah, Susan, how you doing? Good to see you.
Some of us are concerned that the Old Town archaeological site, which is the only remaining bit of the original common field with settlements that we know are still there under the ground, never excavated, has not been included. That's the site of the first 40 years of St. Genevieve's history. Could you comment on that?
No, it's an excellent question, Susan. And the Park Service, when coming up with a study, eventually had followed the National Historic Landmark boundaries, because those were already established, already vetted. And I believe that they were so impressed with the big field and the old town site, that's the reason they recommended the extension of the National Historic Landmark to cover that as well. And if the park unit was established here, there was ample precedence for the National Park Service to work on an expansion of the National Historic Landmark District, which would include that area as well. Yeah, John Carroll, did I say it right? Well, the house that you restored? Okay, good. Any other questions?
I'd like to just comment on the question of when you get here, the comment that we moved from the old town to a place where we didn't get flooded. That's not quite true. In 1993, we had not built a temporary levee around the downtown for the water would have come to the right here to Third and Merchant Street. The Beckett Rabeau, the Amaro, and the Green Tree Tavern all had water over their galleries. We had petitioned for years for a levy. It was not economically justifiable. And finally, the Corps of Engineers and the federal government decided because of our historical houses, they built a $50 million levy. They turned it over to us in, I think, 2002, June 1st, June the 9th, we closed the gates for the first time. And since June 2002, we've had 12 of the 25 highest floods since 1844 have occurred. So we thank you all for paying for that levy.
I really appreciate Bob's point. I want to follow up on that. I will also attest that in internal Park Service discussions, we were very impressed that the Corps of Engineers had made the decision to build the levee not based on economic justification, but historical justification. So you already had another federal agency already coming to the table and very publicly saying this place is worth preserving. And that did have an influence on the Park Service study team as well. Okay, thanks very much. And again, there's free studies up here if you'd like to take them. Thank you.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Bonjour. My name is Christy James. I'm a member of the Center for French Colonial Studies and the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve, as well as Les Amis. And I'm also an officer of the National Society of the Colonial Natives of America in the state of Missouri. Our next speakers are Robert Masrum and Dr. Margaret Kimball Brown. Robert Masrum has worked in Illinois archaeology for over 20 years. He is founder of the Sangamo Archaeological Center and has worked as a historical resource specialist with the Illinois State Archaeological Survey at the University of Illinois Champaign. He specializes in the American pioneer, 1780 to 1840, and French colonial, 1670 to 1780 periods of Illinois and the central Mississippi Valley, with a particular focus on the patterns of consumption of imported and locally manufactured pottery and the roles of folk objects and mass-produced goods in times of colonial transition. Mr. Masrum is the author of 3 books, several articles, and 16 technical papers. Dr. Margaret Kimball Brown is an archaeologist and anthropologist. She is the author of several books on the French colonial settlement of the mid-Mississippi Valley, the villages of Fort Bishop and Prairie du Rocher. She is well known for her work as site administrator for the Cahokia Mounds World Heritage Site from 1984 through 1998, and as a chief archaeologist of the Illinois Department of Conservation. But most important to us, Dr. Brown is the founder and first president of the Center for French Colonial Studies. Please welcome Robert Masrum and Dr. Margaret Kimball Brown, who will present recent archaeology at the Bolduc House.
Thank you. Margaret is hiding out back, but she's here. I'm going to try to talk briefly about what began as a small-scale pilot study to address the state of preservation and the research and interpretive potential of archaeological deposits behind one particular house in town that's rapidly becoming something more programmatic and much more robust than we ever imagined. I just crawled out of a test unit that we're digging behind the Francois Ballet House. We've been working there for 2 weeks. There's an enormous amount of new information coming to light. But this is going to discuss the pilot project that was begun last summer by Margaret, and then I joined the project at the end and I analyzed the materials. So I'm going to share some of the findings of that with you today. We're interested in the backyards of buildings like Bolduc for a number of reasons. Firstly, we're interested in the built environment, not only the house itself, but of outbuildings in the back, which we still don't know that much about archaeologically. And we're also interested in the fact that a lot of garbage was chucked out of the back doors of these houses, and that garbage that we call artifacts tells us quite a bit about what was happening inside the house, both large and small. So this is what the 2015 excavations took place behind the new kitchen that was incorporated into the gallery around 1815, and then behind the replica exterior kitchen. As you know, many of these better built houses would have had exterior or what we call summer kitchens. The stone one here is the replica, of course. So Margaret set up a grid in between those two structures. That's a picture of Margaret pointing and telling you what to do. So she's standing in the back, and I'm in the hall, and here we are again. It was immediately, we had no idea. These structures have been occupied for a very long time and well into the modern period, and we have a very good way of roughing up the archaeological record. Over and over again now, I can tell you from a number of sites that I'm looking at in St. Gen, there is really good news about in the soil. The soil column and the stratigraphy underneath the ground surface is everything. We come here to read that book, the book that is the layers of deposition of centuries of occupation. And in St. Gen, for a number of reasons, we have a very well-preserved soil column with only minor disturbance. I'm not supposed to press the red button. Okay. So here we have some modern disturbance, and by the time we're down in here, this was all pre-Civil War materials. One of the things that we want to do as we progress across town and we look at different sites, domestic sites and other sites, is to kind of define what our purposes are and what our areas of significance are. One of the things we want to do is simply perform a reconnaissance to know what is preserved where and what has been damaged. And then once we know the nature of those deposits, we can come to them with very specific research questions. And the research questions that are designed to be built directly into a very lively interpretive program here in town, or many interpretive programs. So our research focus at Bolduc was primarily on the period of construction, sometime in the 1790s and about 1840, when things are changing dramatically, socially, politically, and as far as material culture, which helps us define horizons in the earth. Immediately below the modern disturbance, the crew encountered a wealth of material, primarily kitchen-related artifacts, pottery, that were deposited right there. We call it a primary deposit, meaning the material was broken right there and largely left alone. And that's exciting because we're seeing, in some cases, very specific events, the dates, certain times. And so as you can see here, it's mostly kitchen crockery. We call it redware. It's of course earthenwares. And at a certain level, almost everything that we were finding predated 1820, it was mostly 1820 or aughts, and we were immediately into our area of significance. Also associated with that was evidence of a strange kind of very early disturbance in the backyard. The excavations were small and the time was limited for that particular season. But what we think we're seeing is an area where a building was standing. And what underneath that building we have evidence of silt deposits, rainwater, flood water, kind of where the water just sits for a while, it tends to leave a silt lamination. And also this bright red soil, which is manganese. Manganese in this kind of soil develops when water is sitting there. So we had an area behind the yard that was rich in domestic debris, kitchen debris, and also was holding water. That's what we knew so far. And you can see here, all of this is all silt. That's not ash. That's all silt, and then this manganese staining surrounding a square post hole and some bricks. So basically now we can see that we're probably dealing with a structure that was located directly behind the house, and it was supported by at least one. Well, it was supported by posts, like piers, if you will, and then underneath it, water was collected. The current replica depicts a rather robust stone-constructed summer kitchen. Throughout the 20th century, the replication of the built environment of vernacular architecture tends to be a little too robust. We build them, to last a little more than they did then, oftentimes because they have to withstand, 100 years of shuffling tourism. So basically, and I've worked in Salem in Illinois for quite some time, and we encounter the same problem, is that when we imagine the past and then replicate it, we tend to just do it a little too well. It tends to be too big and too well built. And we forget about all the little cruddy buildings that people built in behind their houses. And I suspect that the building that we are seeing in the excavations behind the porch were probably something much more ephemeral along these lines. Built on posts or piers, we don't know. We need to expand the excavations, and we intend to do that next year. But you get the idea that the heart's in the right place. But we want to picture the past with a little bit more rough edges, just like today. So basically, after the excavations are over, we're left with a lot of debris, a lot of garbage, and we take this material very seriously. And it takes us much longer to process the material than it does to dig in the dirt. And I'm going to talk now about the nature of the material culture that we found there in the back. When you visit an archaeological site in most parts of the world, you will be hearing people ask about the ceramics. Ceramics are remarkably important to archaeology. We get a lot of information about people from their pots. We talk about what time. Firstly, there are clocks. That's how we tell time. When I'm down 2 feet in the ground and I point to a certain band of soil and I say this dates to 1815 to 1840, I'm doing so because of the ceramics that we find inside of it. And so it tells us time. It begins to tell us identity, of course, French faience versus some other kind of pottery. About trade, how do these things move around, because we know where they were made, they're somewhat mass-produced. Local craft, local folkways, but also consumer choice. One of the things you'll notice about many of the artifacts that I'm going to show you is that they look surprisingly modern, and they're very old, but modernity had arrived here in this region before the new town of St. Genevieve had even been constructed. French faience. We're in a town built by families of French descent, and so we always hope for the marker of that French presence in the form of French faience. On the left is an illustration from our friend Diderot of a faience factory, and this is an example of some of the exact kinds of patterns. These are non-archaeological pieces of faience. They're in my house. That reflect the exact patterns that we do find primarily in colonial sites like in Illinois. So we try to resurrect those fragments with intact patterns that are still, with intact pieces that are still floating around. So this is what faience looks like, tin glazed enamel, earthenware. It's all basically designed to imitate porcelain. And that's something I should say right away. I had a visitor to the site a few days ago that was asking about why is St. Genevieve here and why were the French here? And it was a big question, right? And the short answer is related to this stuff. I had to tell them that when the French pulled into North America in the mid-16th century, they're just looking for a shortcut to China. They're hoping that Mississippi River was going to go to the Pacific. And it wasn't until the 1670s that they realized it was going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico. But this whole endeavor that brought us here today was about shopping. And better yet, it was about shopping for things people didn't need. It was about porcelain teacups and good tea and silks and spices. I mean, arguably, I kind of think we need most of that stuff, you know, but this was something that Western Europe demanded by the middle, well, just after the close of the medieval period, really, by the middle of the 16th century. So this pottery is kind of a tip of that iceberg. We did find a little bit of French faience behind Boldu, not much. The problem is that during the second half of the 18th century, the traditional French faience was suffering at the hands of the masterful mass production and mass distribution of the Staffordshire wares that were pioneered by potters like Wedgwood. We all know about Wedgwood. He's essentially one of the founders of the Industrial Revolution. And he was so successful in making things well, making them inexpensive, and then getting them to you no matter where you live, that it really dealt an almost fatal blow to the faience industry by the second half of the 18th century. The French wanted the British wares just as much as the British. So faience is going away, for the most part, by the time the new town of St. Genevieve is being settled. We do have a few pieces, and I think they're probably heirlooms from the old village, or that they're being purchased in estate sales as second-hand items. This was a large fragment of a tureen, a nice soup tureen. But some of the last faience that survives in these transitional communities at the turn of the 17th and the 18th and 19th century is what we call this faience broom, the brownware. This was designed to be, you could cook in it and then you could bring it to the table. The other kinds of faience were just service vessels, and so the last kind of faience to be in use was the kind of faience, the kind of pottery essentially, that you could have in the oven, bring it to the table. If you tried to do that with Wedgwood's fancy creamware plate, it would shatter into a million pieces. So the last presence of faience is a very pragmatic one, where they still want to be able to cook in vessels and bring them straight to the table. But most of what we're finding is indeed the product of Staffordshire. This material was sent out across Western Europe and all of the colonies that Western Europe held. And you can see here, even in 1809, we have Staffordshire being advertised for sale here in St. James. So this is an example of the material that Margaret's crew dug up behind the house. We just need little pieces. We don't need the whole thing. We need to get a sense of time, and we need to get, count the number of vessels and decide what kinds are here. And so we have a wide range of Staffordshire wares here. And first of all, they tell us time. This is creamware. It predates 1820, goes all the way back to the 1760s. This is pearlware, begins in 1780, goes up to about 1830. And these are other forms of pearlware here as well. So firstly, they tell us time. So we divide these kinds of fragments into the vessel forms. Vessel forms tell us about function, and they tell us about activity in the house. So we have a lot of plates behind Boldu, service plates, and we have in creamware, here's a resurrected version of the creamware plates that were popular at the time. These shell-edged plates. I have looked at a lot of sites that date between 1740 and 1840, and I have never been on one that postdates to 1780 that hasn't produced fragments of these shell-edged plates. Everybody had them. It's remarkable. No matter who you were, if you could afford to own enough things to leave behind garbage for me to find, you own these things. Which is really profoundly reflective of the depth of the effect of the Industrial Revolution, and also on the impact of the potential for anthropology. Everybody had this stuff. It's not French, it's not British, it's everybody. So suddenly we start to remove the identity from the objects, and that gets anthropologists a little nervous. and we have to start thinking more about consumer studies. And then some transfer printed wares, the more decorative, more formal wares. Remember, this is the principal form of decoration, mass-produced decoration, that you could obtain before 1840. There was, of course, no photography available yet. The mass-produced lithographs were not particularly common, and so you decorated your house with exotic scenery, either with something that you made in the home, or that you purchased to basically, ostensibly, to eat off of. So these exotic scenes of Asia or India decorated these houses, and that was the imagery that you could put on essentially the wall. Tablewares are what we just looked at, the things that you're actually eating, just the basic service flatwares. We also find teawares here at Bolden. And teawares are a funny thing because we find them across the American frontier period in places where we know tea was not being consumed. And teawares, as you know, it's a very elaborate ritual that goes back centuries in China that requires a number of, basically 11 different vessels to perform that ceremony properly. And we see teawares on all of these very remote sites occupied by families of middling means, and yet we look at the day books in the ledger, the store books, the ledgers, and we see that they're drinking coffee. We see British travelers that are asking for tea. Their hosts brew it like coffee, and it chokes them. The Americans didn't practice that tea ceremony like the colonial British did. And this is a classic image here of a British woman with her teacup that dates to about 1815. And we have those very images on some of the cups here at Bolden. But the problem with a lot of teacups, and we don't have as many as we do on the American sites, at these French sites, is that the tea ceremony wasn't necessarily something that was particularly important to French households. They are not known for their subscription to the tea ceremony like the British, and instead they have a tradition of chocolates and coffees and so on. So, and they have their own vessels here that were designed for those beverages. We've never done anything like that here. So the question is, are they appropriating here a British, or in this case Chinese export teacup to serve chocolate, or are they losing those other traditions and are they really moving toward tea? So the questions of those old practices and how they're changing are going to be particularly relevant at a transitional community like St. Genevieve. Outside of table service, we have the unrefined ceramics, the ceramics that are used in the kitchen. And here's an example of some of the fragments that we found behind Bolden. During this time period, we can still potentially have pottery, crockery that's brought in from the Mediterranean, southern France, and southern Italy. But we also have American potters setting up shop and making their own folk crockery during this period. In this case, this little handful of artifacts is actually very illustrative of trade and change at St. James. These two fragments here are slip decorated plates or dishes. They're very, very common in the upper Ohio Valley into Pennsylvania. This is what they look like when they're a little bit more intact. I think these are replacing those decorative fan platters that were brown ones that were used in the ovens and at the table. These are in thermal shock. The anti-collectors call them pie plates for pie dishes. So we have a couple of those from Bolden. We have this rim here, which is actually a crushed vessel. We could glue it back together if we go back and do more digging. It's just crushed underneath that building. And it would have looked something like this. It's a lard or a butter pot that would have been made by an American potter. Probably, hard to say at this point, because there's some potters around here that are now making it. And we also have evidence of some traditional French crockery for the kitchen as well, that's lingering. Container glass, another artifact glass. We have little bits and pieces of glass, not much to look at, but all we need is a little piece. Of course, we have the French wine bottles here. There's a fragment here that's a French wine. The wine bottle hasn't changed its shape very much in about 300 years. also black glass bottles that would have been manufactured on the eastern seaboard and would have been used for ale or porter. We have a really interesting inkwell that can actually be glued together. If we can go back out there and dig up more pieces of it, it would look something like this. Probably a product of one of the early American glass houses, something very fancy and rather unusual. And then lots of fragments in medicine bottles that would have had just, they're very crude little bottles that aren't marked and would have had little paper labels. And of course, those labels have dissolved in the ground. And then finally, the little bits and pieces of daily life. This is the fun stuff. You know, we know they smoked from pipes and we know they had buttons on their clothes, but it still brings us closer to these people, and it actually does inform us about some of the practices in the house as well. A little French gunflint. This is a blade-style gunflint that comes in after about 1780. This one was probably a pistol flint. Here, a lovely, rare artifact, a fragment of a tortoiseshell comb, probably of the fashion that was more common in the 18th rather than the early 19th century. So this is already getting a little old and a little out of fashion, and was probably worn in the old village as well. Smoking pipes. We find all kinds of smoking pipes on French colonial sites, as like we do with Native American sites in the time period, not so much with the Euro-Americans, the upland Southerners. The ceremony, sort of much like the tea ceremony, the ceremony of smoking together was critical in the fur trade. It had deep roots, of course, in Native American traditions, and the French adopted those traditions very enthusiastically, and they were using British pipes. So again, you know, we imagine we have tobacco introduced by the Native Americans, being smoked by the French in British pipes. It's a complicated blend. And the buttons too. We have a number of buttons from the site, and considering the richness of the information that you can get about identity and self-identity and ethnicity and any manner of issues about who someone is from the way they dress. We're restricted primarily to buttons and buckles because, of course, the clothing decomposes in the ground or it was just recycled into rags anyway. So we don't get to see clothing very closely in archaeology. And in this case, before about 1840, any buttons we find are going to be associated with men's dress. Women's garments weren't fastened with these kinds of buttons until toward the mid-19th century. So when we find buttons, we're looking at the nature of the way men were dressing. And we're seeing vest buttons and coat buttons primarily. Very nice gilded brass buttons, and in some cases cloth-covered buttons. I'm going to wrap it up here, but I'm talking about last year's work, and I have mud on my shoes from this year's work. It's happening right now. Today is our last day working around the corner from Bolduc here at the Francois Ballet House, which was recently acquired by the colonial Danes, and our mission was to conduct an archaeological reconnaissance of the backyard. Ballet owned most of this property here during the late 18th century. And when we got out there, we realized we're going to have to look at the house too. I can't begin to tell you everything that we found just in the last 2 weeks, but it's been a marvelously informative day. And we understand the house better. It's a very fancy house. There's some really special things in there. And we found an outbuilding behind the house that might be a summer kitchen or perhaps even a smokehouse. Again, everything's been very, very, very well made. It's all posted on still so far, mostly posted on still. And we'll just go through this real quick. So here's the work in the backyard. This is the corner of a very well-made post on still outbuilding behind the house. And then, as I said, we're learning a lot about the inside of the house as well. It's a spectacularly well-made house. It's intact, and the material that we're getting in the backyard reflects the refinement of the house within. We found more Chinese export porcelain there than I've ever seen on a site from this time period. And we're seeing building techniques that are almost identical to some of the techniques used at the Bolduc house, to the point where it almost might seem that they're actually sharing the same carpenters. So there's a lot to learn, and I've been overwhelmed. The crew has been digging furiously for the last 10 days, and just to keep up with what we've done, we're just scratching the surface. So there'll be more to come, but we have a couple minutes for questions.
How do you identify a smoking pipe as British as opposed to French or American?
Because the styles are very distinctive. The Americans did not make those white clay pipes. Really, the British, by the 18th century, dominated the manufacture. Before that, it was the Dutch. But they changed in shape, and diameter, and decoration, and they're pretty well documented. Mm-hmm.
What did you say you first began finding stackerware in St. Genevieve?
When does it appear, you mean? The minute St. Genevieve is settled. It's our, if you're talking about the new town, yeah, it's going to be here with the first settlers that are building houses in 1790. But it appears on the other side of the river, and I'm sure it's in the old town by the 1760s.
Was St. Genevieve one of the wealthier of the early church communities?
I think all of these communities, although they had certain flavors to them, I've worked in Cahokia, the village of, and Prairie du Rocher, and at the Fort de Chartres. I think there's always wealth in them, but there's a range of socioeconomic position. I would say no. I would say these villages are very similar. The wealth comes from trade, and it comes from agriculture, and you do get a wide range of people in that economic spectrum. It's just that some of these villages are much more attuned to, for instance, the fur trade and the Native American trade, like the village of Cahokia. Others, like Prairie du Rocher, are almost entirely agricultural. And of course, here with the new village and the history of the merchants here, trade again is very important. But trade here is also beginning to shift towards supplying a very rapidly growing French population and then also American population. So trade is very important here, so that does bring wealth. But all of these towns tended to kind of split up in very similar ways as far as the rich and the poor. Well, thank you.
Robert, you forgot the announcement.
No.
I'm sorry, Margaret. Margaret is going to be standing on the porch at the Bolduc House at 4 o'clock?
4:30.
4:30? Well, I'm really blowing this. With some of the artifacts from the excavation, and she'll talk to you about that. Also, my crew will be at the site behind the Francois Ballet House until 1 o'clock. So during your lunch break, if you want to get your feet dirty, you can come out and see what we found. It'll be all closed down by the end of the day.